Thanks so much, Dom. Good morning, everyone, and thanks for being here. I want to start out by saying how grateful we are to see so many people taking the time to come together for this conversation on a chilly Saturday morning. So, I'm Liz Ratzloff. I'm the new director of the Center for Labor and Community Studies here at the University of Michigan Dearborn. And I want to just first acknowledge the people who have built and sustained CLCS before me. The center has a long history of labor education and research and convening that's deeply connected to Michigan's labor movement and to working people across the state. And I hope to build on that foundation and help carry it forward in a moment that feels both very challenging and deeply consequential. So I come to this work as a labor organizer with a background in environmental science. My work has been rooted in Michigan and the Great Lakes region, and I'm really passionate about worker led solutions and democratic participation, especially as our economy is reshaped by industrial transition, racial and economic inequality, and climate disruption. Uh, so I wanted to take just a few minutes to frame why we're here today and some suggestions about how perhaps to listen to the conversation that follows. So many of us feel that something isn't working in our democracy right now. Democratic institutions still exist. We still have elections, but for a lot of working people, democracy feels distant and procedural. It can feel like something that happens every few years rather than something that shapes decisions about jobs and housing and school and healthcare, whether a plant closes or a neighborhood gets polluted. And elections matter, they matter a lot, but elections alone have become a thin experience of democracy for a lot of folks. And we're often told that each election is the most important of our lifetime. And at the same time, a lot of folks feel that no matter who wins, many of the decisions that affect their lives are already being made somewhere else. And that's part of why we're talking about participatory democracy today. And when we use that phrase, we're not just talking about being civically engaged or having a voice. We're talking about who actually has power, who gets to shape decisions, and how that works. And not all participation works the same. Some forms of participation ask for people to give input without giving them any real influence. You can think about a public meeting where people are allowed to speak for 2 minutes, but the decision's already been made, or a survey that gathers feedback, but nothing changes after. And that kind of participation can feel frustrating and even demobilizing because it offers voice without power. Other forms of participation are about building capacity. They bring people together to make decisions collectively, develop leaders, and act together over time. So, for example, a union local where members are debating priorities, electing leadership, and deciding whether to take action. Or a community organization that brings residents together to plan a campaign and knock doors, negotiate with decision makers, and keep organizing after a win or a loss. And that distinction, I think, really matters. So a lot of the conversation today is about organizing. And I think it's worth being clear about what we mean by that. Organizing isn't just turning people out to a rally or mobilizing around a single issue, but it's about building durable groups of people who know each other, trust each other, and can act again and again together. It's slower work, and we know it involves a lot of meetings and leadership development and power analysis and often disagreement. But it's also how people build real leverage. And I think labor is central to that story. Workers and unions and worker organizations are one of the places where people regularly practice democracy, making collective decisions, weighing risks, taking action together. And in many communities, their unions are also one of the few institutions that still have the ability to organize at scale and sustain pressure over time. So, as you listen to the panel and our wonderful panelists today, I'd invite you to listen for a few things. Listen for how the panelists talk about the limits of elections and what organizing adds alongside them, and how they define organizing in practice, not just in theory. And also listen for what they say about the conditions that make movement building possible, especially those long-term relationship building and infrastructure that usually exists long before moments of mass action. Uh, and later, when we open things up for discussion, we'll invite you to reflect not just on what you heard, but what it means for you going forward and for your communities. What this conversation suggests about how we organize, and we'll want to ask you to reflect on what institutions like the Center for Labor and Community Studies can do differently if we take democratic capacity seriously, and what the next steps or experiments or commitments feel necessary in this moment. And with that, I'm really glad you're here. I'm looking forward to this conversation so much. And I'll turn it over to Dom now to introduce our panelists.
Thank you so much, Liz. I think that's really helpful for us to have sort of a primer as we talk through and think through a lot of this. So I'm now going to turn it over to our panelists to introduce themselves. Our panelists come from across Southeast Michigan in a variety of capacities. And so I will start pinning them. But if you want to go ahead and kick us off, Brandon.
Thanks, Dom. Hey, folks, what up, though? I'm Brandon Snyder. I am the state director for the Michigan Working Families Party, which is a part of the larger Working Families Party, WFP. I'm a longtime organizer. I've been an organizer in Detroit and throughout Michigan for a number of years. Prior to this job, I was the executive director for Detroit Action, which is a local community group that I made up of folks who are unhoused, tenants, working class Black and brown folks, and young people. I helped found and lead the organization as a part of a marriage between one group, which was the Detroit Action Commonwealth, which was an anti-homelessness organization, and the other group being Good Jobs Now, which was an SEIU campaign that ran on the heels of the Fight for Fair Economy. So helped found and lead that organization. And I stepped down in July of 2024 to help build the WFP in Michigan. And so, I'm a product of a working class family. My mom also actually was a part of the newspaper guild and was a part of the strikes in 95. Um, my dad is a retiree at SEIU 517, and like a lot of Black folks in the city of Detroit, my family worked in the plants, across the metro region, as some of their first jobs, out of the South during the Great Migration. So I'm happy to talk a little bit more about like how I got into organizing, why I'm in this work, and also what we need to do as organizers, as leaders, as working class people to build the multiracial democracy that we deserve, for our material gain. So thanks, y'all.
All right, go ahead, Brianna.
Hi, everyone. Good to see some familiar faces in the room. I'm Brianna Foraker, she, her pronouns, and I am the lead organizer for the Lectures Employee Organization. So that is the union that represents the non-tenure track faculty at University of Michigan, librarians, archivists, curators, and our lecturers there. Um, prior to working at with Leo, which our folks in the room are familiar with, so we'll probably call it Leo. I worked with SEIU, and then have a background in community organizing and actually got to organize my own workplace at AFT National when I was an intern for the National Union, which was my first step into unions. Also, prior member of the Newspaper Guild with some of these fine folks here. And I think outside of that, I'm here in my capacity as a member of the Metro Detroit DSA, where I am a local socialist in office at uh, one of our lower level tier offices at the Ferndale Library. So I'm excited to get the chance to talk to you about that. I was actually elected on this last November, so the same day of the second Trump presidency. So interested to talk to you about how we've been building capacity since then and my work in the labor movement and community.
Great. Thanks, Brianna. Go ahead, David. And you're still muted, David.
I'm David Reynolds. I'm had a career in labor education, first at Wayne State and then at the University of Michigan, and retired as a director of the Center for Labor and Community Studies. So I'm here. I'm a social scientist by training, and I'm currently working on a book called "The People Shall Govern: Progressive Politics in the Age of Trump." And it's about the untold story of all the local and state organizing that's going on around the country. And reflective of Liz's comments, there's 6 chapters, only one of which is about mobilizing for elections. And I'm really glad to be on with Brandon because my chapter 4, about half the chapter 4 is all about the Working Families Party and the great work they're doing. So.
Great. And then last but not least, Lara, go ahead.
Hi, good morning. My name is Laura Roosh. I'm an associate professor of political science at U of M Dearborn. I teach a class in community organizing, and I'm let's see, what else? I'm a member of our growing AAU American Association of University Professors chapter. And, back when I was in graduate school, I was a member of GEO and in Ann Arbor. And let's see, what else? I'm also on the board of Moses of Detroit, which is a interfaith congregation-based organizing group. And last but not least, I'm co-editor of a journal called Community Organizing Journal, and I'll drop it in the chat. And a lot of the questions that we are going to be, and solutions that we're going to talk about today are hashed out in that journal. And we look forward to submissions from academics and practitioners, and we really want it to be accessible and have practitioners involved. So just a shout out for the journal, but it's really an honor to be here with you all. Thanks.
Great. Thank you all. And I suppose I realized I didn't introduce myself. My name is Dom Błowicz. I work as the comms coordinator at CLCS. I'm also a member of my staff union, AFT Michigan Local 284, USU. And then formerly, I was a newspaper guild member, as seems to be the theme. I used to work as an organizer for GEO, the graduate union at U of M. So I'm now going to turn it over to David, who is going to give us a brief presentation on sort of where are we now in the political landscape, and how can we use some historical context to sort of situate us in the current moment. So, David, if you want to go ahead and share your screen, I will unpin
Sure.
myself.
What I'm going to be doing, this is a presentation that I originally developed for the Rapid Response Network for the Huron Valley AFL-CIO, which is getting together people to mobilize, to be available to mobilize, basically. And I think people can see it now. So this is a presentation. Basically, what do we do now? And the short of it is if we're going to save our democracy, we have to deepen it. So to understand where we're at now, I just want to briefly touch on 3 things. How do we get here? How have we fought back before? and what do we have the most control over now in this moment. So, how do we get here? The rise of fascism historically has been very well documented and studied. And to boil all that down to two basic points, two things essentially happened in Germany and Italy and elsewhere. A substantial part of the corporate class concluded that democracy did not work for them and they needed an authoritarian solution. The German Nazis would have never had any traction had they not been funded by corporate money. And then at the same time, mired in the compromises with the political establishment, the center left did not offer a change agenda at a time when many people thought things were not working and they wanted change and they were not offered actual change. So we can see this path happening again in the United States. I was born in the 1963, so that was a period in which the United States was globally economically dominant. And two things uniquely happened simultaneously. Corporations could enjoy record profits, and an unprecedented number of working people, not all, but an unprecedented number could enjoy the middle class, right? And that's when our unions negotiated all those middle class wages and benefits and standard of living. Unfortunately, it could not last. And as we get into the later 20th century, corporations are seeing those super high profits begin to shrink, and they're starting to look for an alternative. And with the election of Ronald Reagan, we saw that alternative as he shifts from the New Deal to supply side economics, which, boiling it down, is really essentially two things. One is cutting social spending and taxes on corporation on the wealthy, and the other is reducing regulations on business, including declaring open season on the American labor movement. We do need to remember that this was, at a certain level, a bipartisan agenda, right? So, Democratic President Bill Clinton fought for and signed into law the North American Free Trade Agreement. And he also famously fought for and repealed the Glass-Steagall economics regulation that prevented Wall Street from melting down. And once that was repealed, we got the Great Recession. And so that brings us up to the 21st century. Supply side economics has delivered increasing wealth. We are as wealthy as we have ever been, but that's only enjoyed by the very people at the very top. A record number of billionaires. The average 80% of the population, their standard of living has stagnated and fallen. So as we get into the 21st century, corporate America is essentially split between two large camps. The centrists who basically say, okay, well, the changes of the late 20th century returned our profitability. We're fine. Things are fine. We'll tinker at the edges. And this part of corporate America has decided that, if America is going to be a diverse society in which whites are going to be a minority by mid-century, they're going to embrace that. They're going to embrace that. They're going to market to it. They're going to live with it, even celebrate it. And then there is a right wing that have essentially concluded that they have failed in their ultimate goal, which is to outright destroy the New Deal and erase the 20th century, which was simply a mistake. And by that, they mean go back to the good old days of the 19th century when white, male, straight, Christian, wealthy men ruled the country and were celebrated as such. So when this corporate right, when they say they want to get rid of the New Deal, they mean the entire 20th century. They're not kidding about this. To give you an idea of some of these people's thinking, James Buchanan was a major intellectual figure. He's dead now, but he was a major intellectual figure in the rise of the corporate right. And he wrote a famous book called Freedom of Liberty. And if you just read this, oh, hold on. Did I just lose sharing?
No, I still see your
No.
screen.
Okay, I can't see my screen. Crap. I was trying to get something out of the way so I could read it. Okay, where is my screen? I do not know.
And
Okay.
oh,
Very good. The The citizen who finds that he must, on fear of punishment, pay taxes for public good in excess of the amounts that he might voluntarily contribute. What distinguishes this from the thug who takes his wallet in Central Park? So this guy is basically saying that taxes are theft, essentially. So when they talk about freedom of liberty, that's what they mean by freedom and liberty, in liberty. And a person from George Mason University, which is a major think tank location for this kind of thinking, the freest countries generally have not been democratic. The weakening of checks and balances would increase the chances of a very good outcome. So, for since he came to power in Hungary, Viktor Orban, who is I really got to call him a dictator now. He's officially a president. He has been a love child of the corporate right. He has visited the United States on numerous occasions. He's been to the CPAC meetings. He gets standing ovations. They love this guy. And he is an authoritarian ruler. And if you look at some of the keys, you can see stuff resonating what's happened the last year. He purged his party of everyone who wasn't loyal to him personally. He captured the judiciary. He replaced elected officials with his own people. He rewrote the election law. And even though his party gets a declining portion of the vote, they are actually growing their presence in the legislature, and he's essentially prime minister for life. So by 2016, the corporate right had essentially gotten a slate of Republican presidential nominees that were bought into this authoritarian agenda. And then a wild card entered the race when Trump came in. And these corporate right people, this was not loves and kisses from the get-go. I mean, let's face it, Trump is an asshole. And you even listen to stuff, even today, people will privately not say very nice things about him, who are some of his main backers. However, I think they came around to him because for all his faults, he has a talent, and that talent is creating a brand. Think about it. You know, he came to fame with The Apprentice. The Apprentice was a so-called reality TV show presenting what appears to be something happening in real life, live, when in fact the show was scripted. It was a lot of it was fake and scripted ahead of time, right? So that's perfect. That's exactly the person we want because his brand is fascism and its whole alternate reality. And what is that alternate reality? It's a fake anti-establishmentism, right? Because obviously the real establishment is corporate America and corporate profit making, but fascism wants to embrace and leave that free and unchecked. So you need a phony establishment, but you can see Donald Trump here, I speak for you, the people against the elites who betrayed and deceived you, right? I have been on a mission to rescue our nation from a failed and corrupt political establishment, right? Sounds almost left wing, right? Except that obviously it's the, mysterious deep state and the liberal establishment, and of course the others, whether they're the Nazis beating on the Jews or the foreigners that are coming here and ruining America. However, Trump's popularity also has a flip side to it, and that is the corporate centrists who want to maintain things the way they are. So in 2024, they funded Harris's campaign over $1.5 billion. That was a record amount spent on a presidential election. It completely outspent Trump. And she ran on a platform famously in an intermediate interview saying, when asked, well, what would you do differently from Biden? Not a thing comes to mind. And so, literally, the entire strategy and that $1.5 billion went into trying to convince swing voters, about 4 to 6% of the voting population, who were college educated and lived in suburbs, to maybe go swing Democratic. And so here's the result, right? Of the exit polls, 1/3 of voters told exit pollsters that the economy was working for them, and so they voted for Harris. 2/3 of the voters told exit pollsters that the economy was not working for them, and 70% went for Trump. 5 million people just stayed home that had voted in 2020, and Trump won by 2 million votes. All right, that's how we got here. the good news is this is not entirely new, and we have fought these forces before. And the white people may be new to fascism, but black people have not. And the Black freedom movement is very familiar with fascism, including how the civil rights movement fought its Jim Crow version of that. And I call it fascism because it combined, organized state violence with this appeal to an alternative reality, which is on show here. I apologize; these are gruesome pictures, but the reason we have so many lynching pictures is because these are from postcards, that this was a form of entertainment, right? And so you go to the lynching, you get a postcard, had a great time last night. How are Bob and Mary doing? You send it to your relatives. So to give you the, if we think the MAGA warp today, this has happened before. So how did the civil rights movement fought back? Well, they looked for ways to use economic power, including boycotting the Montgomery bus system. They disrupted things as usual because fascists want to normalize their rule. We're all in this together. No one disagrees. Uh, and this by sitting in at lunch counters, by picketing the Woolworths, we're saying no, this is not the way things normally are. By riding the buses and risking being personally attacked by riding an integrated bus, or by getting the crap bag beat out of you by the police. Again, the famous Birmingham Children's March. The civil rights movement picked Birmingham because they knew that the local police chief was a hothead who would overreact, and they wanted him to overreact because what did this do? This put the brutality of Jim Crow racism out before the nation and the world, and really compelled the national government to do something about it. And the fascists, they don't want that. They want, oh, everybody's happy, everybody knows their place, they're staying in line. And ultimately, folks showed their numbers. Now, the danger is that you look at pictures like this and you say, oh, well, everybody marched together and we defeated racism across. Well, this took 10 years of organizing to get to the point where you could pull off a big march in Washington. And what we need to remember is that this was very controversial, right? A good part of the labor movement did not support the march because they feared violence, right? Now, to its credit, we see Walter Reuther here. The UAW was a key backer of the march. And this march was very much about jobs, not just ending segregation. All right, the second example is how working people confronted centrism in the 1930s. And it's just a quick reminder that we don't want to get caught up in the myth that the New Deal came because an enlightened governor, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, got elected president and reformed the country. He was kind of a Obama-like change candidate, but his initial changes were very, very modest. They were not what we today think of as the New Deal. And he was driven to more radical approach because the economic recovery didn't happen. And amidst that, working people were taking matters into their own hands. So what do I mean by taking matters into your own hands? Well, if people getting evicted, you physically stop the eviction by surrounding the police. By the way, this stuff was going on during the Great Recession in Detroit, so it's not a dim, buried history. Okay, we talk about affordability today. Well, you picket the meat markets. You can't afford the rent, you strike and withhold your rent. You show your numbers and you're not going to be intimidated. This is the famous Ford Hunger March in 1932, where laid off Ford workers and their supporters marched at the Rouge Complex, where they were met with the Dearborn police shooting and killing 5 people. But then famously, 65,000 people sent a very loud message showing up to the funeral procession. And today we've got ICE, we've got the National Guard being sent into American cities. Well, that happened in Toledo in 1934. There was a strike at the Autolite plant, and the strikers first, the picketing was declared illegal, so they picketed anyhow, and the police came to arrest them, but the strikers and their supporters eventually drove off the police. So then the governor sent in the Ohio National Guard, a unit not recruited from Toledo, and two people were killed, but the crowd grew to 10,000 and they drove the National Guard out of the city. And so with that, Autolite was forced to bargain a contract with the newly formed union. And our famous sit-down strike wave. Again, that was innovation, right? If they're going to try and replace you if you walk out, then don't walk out. Seize the factory. And again, it was the organizing inside, but also the support outside, including the Women's Auxiliary and the Emergency Brigade with their famous Red Berets. And they are armed because they did actually fight a pitched battle with the Flint police. And also, elections mattered, right? The sit down in Flint was timed so that the Detroit's mayor, Frank Murphy, would become governor, right? He was the newly elected governor. They waited for him to get in office because he pledged not to use the guard against striking workers. And he was denounced in the media, communist sympathizer, all this stuff. It was working class people pounding the pavement, getting out to vote for him. And he remained true. He brought the guard in, but they were truly neutral in the conflict. All right, so what does that bring us up to where we're at now? And I just want to highlight two things that I think we have most control over. One is our state and local governments, and another is our direct action. So, I teach political science, and one of the things that's distinct about America is the 10th Amendment to the Constitution, which essentially says that if the Constitution nor an act passed by Congress does not explicitly say a state can't do something, then it can do it. So state governments have enormous power in our society. And the right figured this out a long time ago while the left was just looking at the national government. And that's how they have built power and that led to Trump. If you look at what's happened in southern and some of the western states. So we have to make sure that our states, our democratic controlled states, are part of the resistance. And that they protect democratic elections and they prosecute illegal behavior. With the ICE budget in Congress just allocated more to ICE, but the original allocation made it the 14th largest military organization in the world. Reminds me very much of what Hitler did with his elite SS, which was a military unit, but also a political unit. However, states and local governments can stand up to this. So I don't know if you remember back in October where Trump was all talking about how he was going to send federal agents into San Francisco. And then the San Francisco District Attorney, Brooke Jenkins, prepared her office to act. And she said if the same tactics were used in San Francisco that were used elsewhere, she would treat agents like anyone else who committed assault and battery. And former Speaker Nancy Pelosi and Representative Ken Mullen immediately backed her up. And all of a sudden, Trump stopped talking about sending the Guard into San Francisco. So for the 2026 elections, we're in a key state. We have a close Senate race. There's at least 3 close Republican seats. The one that goes from Lansing to Brighton is one of the tightest in the entire country. We also have an election for our governor, for our House and our Senate. And what are the Dems going to stand for if they take power again fully? We also have to think about defending the elections because we know what Trump did in 2020. He had fake electors. He had an enraged mob at Cobo Hall decrying they're stealing the election. They're stealing the election, right? And that attempted to provide cover for the Wayne County Board of Canvassers not to certify the Detroit vote. The State Board of Canvassers also waffled for a while. and the Republican Senate, controlled Senate, did an investigation. Although the guy that led the investigation was honest and showed there was not anything irregular with the election, and his Republican colleagues denounced him for telling the truth. So what is Trump talking about recently? Well, let's just call the elections off. He's already gotten the post office to change when mail is marked, stamped, received, so that it's not when you immediately drop your mail off, but it's down the process. So that means your ballot, oh, yeah, it arrived. It's got a postmark after the election, doesn't count. And is there going to be an emergency and ICE and the guards sent into targeted areas? But it's not just enough for our state and local governments to be part of the resistance. They can't just be what they're against. The 2024 elections made that very clear. You've got to show people a positive vision of a better future, and we can build that. That's why Mondani's election in New York was such a big deal. Across the political spectrum, analysts agreed that this was a big deal because he was about a very different agenda, right? The problem is the cost of living and growing inequality. The culprit is clear. It's the rich and corporations who are buying our elections. He had real solutions that were easy to understand: freeze the rent, make the buses free, make childcare free, right? And the whole image, I think, is contrast such to Trump. Look, he's happy. Every time you see him, he's happy, right? He's excited because he has a vibrant, positive vision of the future, whereas Trump is angry and we got to beat up the people who are ripping us off kind of thing, right? So, Mondani's victory didn't come out of nowhere. There's been 20 years of organizing in New York State. This organizing, including the Democratic Socialists of America, sent Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez to Congress. They've run, and the Working Families Party is a huge part of this. They ran hundreds of people for local and state office. The Working Families Party was a critical component of knocking off Republican rule in the state Senate and making New York an actual Democratic majority. And they also established public financing in New York City, which made it easier for Mamdani to run. And just some other examples, you think about things like Obamacare and trying to explain that to someone and how that's going to get them health care. Whereas you could just say, you know what, we're going to have a public health plan that everybody gets. Right? And Oregon is actually the legislature set up a commission which is going to report this year on how to do a single payer health system in Oregon. New Mexico last year has the nation's first state-funded free childcare, just like Mondani's doing in New York. And in Michigan, we said, okay, you know what? College should be free. So let's start with our community college. You don't need to pay tuition to come to community college. These are accessible solutions. We should be standing for them. There's folks out there now collecting ballot signatures for an initiative to amend our Constitution to tax people that get $1 million or more, couples, to money dedicated to our public schools. States can support worker organizing. Oregon now gives unemployment compensation if you go on strike. With Trump shutting down the National Labor Relations Board, California said, well, our public sector labor board is going to handle private sector disputes as well. And you can be bold. In California, the minimum wage for fast food workers is $20 an hour because the state set up a fast food council that got together industry, worker, and government representatives to set conditions for the entire industry. And encourages regional to do their own councils. That's innovative thinking. It's simple. It's exciting to people. And we have to remember that states do run elections, not the national government. There's a group out there trying to get ballot signatures to mandate that you have to be a citizen to vote or prove you're a citizen to vote in Michigan. But there's also the opposite. There's a coalition of groups trying to get money out of politics in Michigan. You can't do that across the board, but you can certainly get rid of the conflicts of interest. And this ballot initiative is about banning utilities and contractors for the state from spending money in Michigan elections. It should not surprise anybody that Detroit Edison is a major funder of our elections. And in Montana, there's a work to get on the ballot an initiative that would get at elections a different way, which is you can't ban money in corporate money in elections, but it turns out corporations are creations of the law, and a lot of that law exists at the state level. So they want to change Montana incorporation law to redefine a corporation as something that is not allowed to spend money in politics, which would apply not just to Montana corporation, but any corporation working in Montana. And we've seen with the whole gutting of our health policies that Democratic controlled states are beginning to come together. Some have even talked about a soft succession where Democratic controlled states basically go and do their own things. And folks have pointed out that, when Biden was president, the Supreme Court had a series of decisions that allowed Republican controlled states to avoid the federal government and to do their own thing. And so they're either going to be blatant hypocrites or they're going to uphold some of those rulings. Finally, we can lead with our own direct action. I know that people say, well, yeah, okay, another demonstration, what difference does it make? But if the corporate right doesn't care about mass demonstrations, then why are they sending the military into democratically controlled cities? Why this obsession with the Gaza protests? Uh, there's this famous study by political Erica Chenoweth to estimate what portion of the population do you need to be engaged in nonviolent protest, after which a regime will not survive, and the percentage was 3.5%. Doesn't mean the regime instantly goes down, but no regime has survived over the long term for that. And the No Kings rallies in October were 2% of the population. So we need to target the pillars that authoritarians need to rule: the corporate money, the media, the education institution, the police, the civil servants, and the military. And just some echoes of the past coming forward. We're at the beginning stages of figuring out targeted boycotts and how to do that, but we're already seeing these things kind of emerge. Um, with the actions in Minnesota yesterday, there was a support to send letters to these companies, like Target, which is identified with Minnesota, to say, look, you can't be on the sideline. You got to come out against what ICE is doing. And then in the case of Hilton, is you should not have contracts with ICE to be, lodging ICE officers. Our college campuses and our universities have been targeted. We got to help give the administration a spine to stand up to Trump. They're coming after our public schools. So again, we need to support our administrators to stand up to Trump. And of course, we can be involved if ICE is in our communities. In Washtenaw County here, these are just two groups that are involved. The first one, Mira, is doing stuff like they're doing in the Twin Cities, where they're setting up a network to observe ICE, get the word out that ICE is there, document what's going on. And then there's another group, Wicker, to deal with the aftermath, because when people are kidnapped, their families, their loved ones are left behind, and there's a lot of work in, trying to support them as well. And, just recently, a bunch of activists showed up at the Wayne County Airport Authority, which probably wasn't used to having activists come and talk to them. But it turns out the Willow Run Airport has been flying flights for ICE, and 10,000 to 18,000 people have been flown out of the Willow Run Airport. So let's shut that node in the ICE machine down. Martin Luther King, very famous: hate cannot drive out hate, only love can do that. And another world is possible.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, David. I think that does just so much work to sort of historically situate us in this conversation. As we're thinking about the strength and limitations of electoralism, and also all of the other actions and engagement with the democratic process that are necessary to, stage something at a larger scale. So we are now going to move into our question portion, where I'm going to pose a few questions to our panelists. As we're doing this, for for the attendees, if you have questions or comments or want to add to anything, please feel free to use the chat, and then we'll have sort of a discussion and general Q&A at the end. For the question in the chat, will we get access to this later? We will be sending out a recap email with all of the materials, including the recording, and I believe we can send like a PDF of the slides. So you will get that. And if you didn't pre-register for the symposium, go ahead and drop your email in the chat, and we'll make sure it gets to you. But let's go ahead and turn now to our panelists. And I think, like I said, David's presentation really helps contextualize some of this. My first question, for many working people, democracy is, as Liz said, experienced almost entirely as waiting. 1 year, 2 year, 4 years for the next election, which are often framed as the most important of our lifetimes, which is often true. At the same time, trust in democratic institutions generally continues to erode. From your perspectives, panelists, what can elections do and what can't they do when it comes to building real power for working people? And I guess with the ongoing erosion of US democracy and related trust, with that in mind, how do you understand the relationship between elections and organizing? So I'll pitch it first to Brianna.
Yeah, so I mentioned at the top that I'm a member of the Metro Detroit Democratic Socialists and was endorsed by DSA as a socialist in office. You maybe have not heard of me, but you've probably heard of candidates like Rashida Tlaib, who is also a socialist in office. And so I think for DSA, when we're thinking about the importance of engaging in electoral politics and doing that locally, I've had the opportunity to see how that is effective on a local level and what that can mean for organizing and building power. And so, I mean, I think it's one tool that we have engaging in electoral politics to build that better world that we know is possible. Um, and I think also it's a tool that we can't ignore right now with the rise of fascism. We've seen these genocidal efforts to systematically target Black, brown, queer, and poor communities. And so it's a matter of life and death right now. The fascists are infiltrating and exerting power at every level of government. And, David talked about places like New York, other places where the message that represents working class people and gives this vision that's different from corporate democratic politics and far right politics, what that means when electoral candidates can engage and secure power that represents working class communities, but also what that can mean if it galvanizes larger engagement in priorities that are actually rooted in those communities, coming from communities of working class people and affecting their material struggles, engaging unions in that process, and not just at election day in the lead up to turnout, but what that means in informing policies and building those organizations beyond. So I think, for DSA, that's been the Mamdani win has been one of our largest growth points that we've had since the Bernie elections. And that means more people coming into our organization and getting trained up to be organizers, to engage in their own communities, getting skills to be worker organizing. But like I said, it's not just election day, it means doing electoral politics differently. So I think if we are doing electoral politics differently, um, that means identifying leaders in our communities who are doing that, and not just leaders who are running for these offices, but in the campaigns, using that to identify community leaders and building on our infrastructure there, um, and building our organizing muscle. And so I just want to briefly talk about how we did this on a small scale in Ferndale. So I ended up running for this office based off a news guild organizing effort by our Ferndale library workers who decided to form a union and then uh, move on to future contract campaigns. And DSA and community members came out and supported that effort. And we said, okay, what is the next thing that we can do here to continue to build this community support for our libraries and build on what's happening here in worker organizing? And so one of those things was running pro-labor candidates to be on the library board, who has some decision-making power there, and how that affects the day-to-day life. And so, the campaign was the first part deciding to run there. And so along the way, uh, it wasn't just about like the election day, but about how we can identify leaders in the community, how we can build their skills. So, having an organizing conversation on the doors or having an organizing conversation with your community members where you're talking about the library or common good things that really resonate with people and talking about the importance of, respecting workers, that those conversations were not just one-off lead up to election day and then we're done. Our plan all along, which luckily we were able to secure those seats, which will have some impact, material impact on what that means for the decisions of the board. But more so, we built an organizing committee in the Ferndale area that's doing political education, that's doing community organizing. We've started working the Migro Watch, right, group, building that group. We've run a campaign that we're continuing to engage in around getting ALPR surveillance technology out of our cities. And so we're building up that muscle, and it's not just about the election. And this is a model that DSA has embraced as a chapter. So Dylan Wagella, our state rep who represents Garden City, Inkster, Romulus, Westland, Mikhail Goodman, who's a Pontiac City Council person. We're building these organizing committees because it's not just about the candidate or the election, but about the power that working people can build beyond that. So, and that being said, I think it's not just the electoral work where we need to be building that power, but also, in our workplaces, right? So building that union power there.
Wonderful. I'm going to pass it now to Brandon, who I think can add some extra context in the with regards to the Working Families Party.
Yeah, thanks for that, Dom. So I'll just say like one of the things that I want to lift up has been doubled down a couple of times is that elections are not a period in the sentence, they're a comma, right? So we actually have to be thinking about what happens before election day and what happens after election day in order to be able to capitalize on that groundswell of energy, the groundswell of ideas and eyeballs that come on that come on because of this 4 years of waiting. So many of our folks, participate in democracy and they only see democracy as that election. And so how we think about organizing, whether it's at the WFP, whether it's at Detroit Action, my former political home, whether it's DSA, is that we actually have to be trying to demonstrate democracy in every single one of our activities, at the Union Hall, wherever, so that way we can actually be able to show people that this is a process that works. There's a lot of critiques about like the current state of democracy. Have we ever experienced one and whatnot? But, for a lot of, folks, black folks like me who, get this analogy, our current democracy is like a hoopty, it's like a car. Like you'd rather have a hoopty that where you got to put a little bit of gas and a little bit of, water in the car and in it, to keep it running, then no democracy, no hoopty at all. So I think for me, like our call as organizers, as activists is how do we rebuild this thing to be something that we actually want and deserve? And so WFP thinks a lot about that, from not just the federal level where a lot of our time, attention, money is focused at elections, but actually on the ground level. And it thinks about elections as an opportunity to quote unquote electoralize issues that matter to folks every day. So David talked a lot about, Zoran's message was around affordability, it was around childcare, buses, and rent. There were organizations that worked alongside of the Mandani campaign that shaped that analysis, that shaped that messaging, that ran with him to talk about not only do we elect this person as a candidate, as an elected official, but here are the policy platforms, here are the stories, here are the experiences that are happening to everyday members. This is the pathway in terms of policy that we want to be able to enact with this movement, not this candidate, but with this movement. And the strategy is to elect, to win, and then to hold accountable. And you see the formations being taking shape. So like our friends, when you think about the WFP, our in New York and how we're building in Michigan, our coalition is made up of labor unions and community organizing groups. And so in New York, for example, you think using this Mamdani example, groups like Community Voices Heard, which, started out as a tenants organization of, women in New York, led the fight and led the analysis and strategy around the need for child care, the need for tenant protections. They were the ones who pushed and pushed and pushed and did some of the early endorsements to make sure that Mandani was a viable candidate. So I think when we think about how this, and then let me just take us out of the Mandani example to think about like this is a tool that movement should be doing and can be doing. When you think about this, the work of formations like DSA and community organizations, this practice, is done in Chicago in 2016 during the attorney general or state attorney general, which is the county prosecutors races. So you think about Laquan McDonald, who was the young man who was shot and who was killed by Chicago police officers. It was groups like BYP 100 and a number of local community faith and organizing groups, as well as DSA, that elevated the importance of that county prosecutor race, talked about the need for protection, the need for a different prosecutor, and the policies that need to happen, and then made and created a organizing plan on elections. So I think the thing that I want to like just elevate when we talk about WFP and this idea of electoralism is this quote from Dr. Barbara Ransby. And, she wrote a book on Ella Baker. She, the activist from the city of Detroit, by the way. But she also, she talks about this point that like elections are important, but insufficient. They are not enough for us to like get liberation. It is the work of actively being out on the streets, actively building mutual aid communities, actively, building unions in your, at your job site. And we actually have to figure out how do we counteract the punches that are being thrown by the corporate class because they see elections as very important. They see elections as a tool that they can use and they can wield. It can't be the only tool, but they see it as a tool that they can engage in. And so for us, as we think about building the WFP in Michigan, we work hand in hand with DSA this past summer to elect Denzel McCampbell for Detroit City Council. We're working the analysis of why that race and why Denzel came because of policy and came because of the fact that one of the state representatives who harmed our communities by voting against reproductive rights, by voting against paid leave, by throwing monkey wrenches and a number of other policy issues that our communities had long worked for, was attempting to run for city council and was being backed by the billionaire class. And for us, we actually had to figure out like how do we throw a punch? How do we build a groundswell of movement on the west side? And then, and then what does it mean to build a long-term, durable, multiracial base that can actually hold down these policy fights and challenge Denzel, frankly, even though he's a friend, hold him accountable when he's in office. And so this work that we're doing is a continuation of that at the WFP. Like we're continuing to build with community and labor unions. We're going to continue to think about like what are the opportunities for us to recruit and elect values aligned candidates. I don't want to say progressive, but values aligned candidates who share, who will actually work for working class people? And then what are the opportunities to fracture the base that the corporate class has built? And how do we do that in ways where we can actually engage many of these working class whites and working class people across race who are leaving the Democratic Party and offer them an alternative vision for what power and community and politics, frankly, can look like?
Wonderful. I mean, thank you for that response. I think really what you're talking about here is like democratizing campaigns and also widening our view of what campaigns are, right? They're not sort of time bound, they're movements. With that in mind, I'm going to turn it to Laura to hear your perspective on this question. Go ahead.
Hi, thanks. I feel like I'm just nodding continuously while Brianna and Brandon are speaking. So I really appreciate your insights and hearing about the role of the WFP and the DSA locally is really inspiring. While David was speaking earlier, I was thinking about I was just jotting down notes and thinking about how we understand democracy as Americans, and um, that I feel, as the kid grew up in the 70s and 80s, I felt that I was told and taught that the United States has, the strongest, most best example of democracy that was, worthy of and supposed to be implemented abroad, right? Even by force. And that this idea of democracy, first of all, something that could be forced upon others is really uh, kind of counterfactual, but also that was embedded in this thinking that it exists without us in a way, that it's this that democracy are these institutions that work on our behalf. And so participatory democracy in that framework is something that you can choose to participate in or not, but it's still happening, right? Because it's vested in the institutions rather than in some knowledge and capacity and networks and power of the public. And so the way that we think about, I think that most Americans have been taught and told to think about democracy is a representative form of democracy, which is very valuable and important. I don't mean to undermine that, but just stay with me here that, that the public's down here to affirm these people who are in office. And then once in a while, we can change them if we feel compelled to, and it'll just keep going. Right. But I think if we can imagine a democracy, and going back to what David was saying about imagining different kinds of futures, if you imagine a democracy as the civil society of the public deciding what's important to us and making it happen. And one way we make that happen is by electing and paying people who do certain tasks on our behalf, right? But the democracy is us and our interrelated civic associations continually building agendas that we require our elected officials to implement. And then if they're not doing a good job, we remove them. Like to put the power um, of the initiative, to take another kind of democratic word, to take the initiative and put it in the public and believe and know that we're capable and worthy of doing so. Okay. And so I think I come to, my thoughts about elections, the ways that my friends here were speaking about it in terms of building parties that are effective and responsive to the public, or advocacy organizations or what have you, that I always want to have it rooted in that idea of, and from an organizing perspective, people are beautiful, they're valuable, they're our family, and we're here for them. Okay, so that's what I really think of as a healthy democratic society. And if our government isn't helping us with that, it's not only that we're consenting to them, it's, what are we doing here? So that's sort of the framing that I put. And so I feel that, when David mentioned that idea that Trump tapped into, the idea that elites have deceived us and, exploited workers, exploited the public, the grains of truth in that are also true regarding how we understand democracy, that we're deceived and told, how can it be that our system, that he laid out from, the 1980s to, be anti-worker, to uh, ramp up mass incarceration to fund companies to imprison people. How could that be coincide with our understanding as democracy, right? And to be taught at the same time that we have the superior democracy while these things were happening. I think that's a real mind F to play on the American public. And there's a reason people are angry, but the tool of organizing is to help people see how those power structures work. And okay, so I have so much to say. Also, I want to say that an important thing about the role of people in elections is always keeping in mind those who cannot participate in elections. And it could be because you're sick that day or you're sick that year, or it could be that you're giving birth or that you are cognitively impaired, or that you are in prison, or that you're a baby. Where the democracy is for all of us. And the idea that the valuable person who deserves political accountability is the person who can happen to show up on election day is, again, really messed up. And it's not the way we behave in our everyday communities. And so the mutual aid shows what's possible. But so maybe I could say more, but I want to keep it moving. And I'm really interested in hearing about the questions later on. So thanks.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much, Laura. I think that like provides a wider contextualization and sort of gets us thinking about systems and, like you put in the notes, ecologies. Let's move on to our second question. So, what I'm hearing you all describe is this shift from politics centered around the race to election day towards something more continuous, something more organic. And I want to note on like the word organizing, because that can mean a whole lot of different things, and I think it's a word that maybe needs some demystifying. So when each of you says organizing, what are you talking about in practice? So what distinguishes organizing from mobilizing, from advocacy, from community development, from mutual aid, from engagement? And surely there's like a big Venn diagram here where everything is sort of overlapped with one another. And what forms of organizing have you seen that actually do work to build durable power, rather than just producing moments of action? And there's probably also some sort of spectrum there as well. So I think I'll start with David, and pass it over to you first.
Actually, why don't you pass it to someone else? Because I was not prepared.
That is all right.
And
Let's
I want
go,
to hear from the
Brianna.
other.
Yeah, I can say something briefly. Uh, just I saw this question and I actually thought back to some training that I think I did with Liz Bratzloff, the Organizing for Power training with Jane McAlevey and the Rosa Luxemburg Center. And so I think when I think about the difference between organizing and mobilizing, I think about organizing is centered on building mass power, right? So when I think about mobilizing, I'm thinking about a one-off event potentially. You're calling you're calling all your friends, getting all the like-minded people out there versus organizing, which is rooted in building large, sustained, super majority movements, right? And so I think that that's where we talked at the beginning, right? I think about how that just takes time. It's a lot of time. Organizing's a lot of conversations. It's built based on strategy and it's based on power. And so, I mean, I think ultimately that is our goal, right? Is to seize this power and use it to influence the world we want to see. And so, organizing is deep. And it's based on a long time building that capacity in our communities. I'll keep it brief because I want to hear all these brilliant people here.
Thank you so much. And one thing that I noted you say was, mobilizing can be like get all your like-minded pals to go do a thing. Organizing is like changing minds, so like identifying people who can change the way that they're thinking about it and doing the work of making that change happen. Um, all right, David, may I pass it to you now?
Sure. I'll just give one illustration of the difference, right? Because I did this, I've been involved in those ballot drives for the money out of politics and to raise money for the schools. So, a common sense way to think about it is, okay, well, I go and I collect the signatures and I get them on the board and then I hand them over and I'm done, right? But the organizing mindset says, I'm talking to these people. Before I hand this over, who are these people? I am going to note them down. And ones that I had good conversation with, how can I stay in touch with them? Right. So that's the difference between organizing and just mobilization.
Um, Brandon, Laura, anything you'd like to add?
Yeah, just really quickly. So I mentioned just a little bit in the opener. So I got involved in organizing through student leadership at the University of Michigan. I was involved in the Black Student Union, was involved in, all of the sort of activist activities and volunteer activities that were taking shape at the time I was there. But I think the things that sort of that shape organizing for me and it also led me into this moment is one. Many of you all know, I took a class and I was a mentor of Greg Marcus, who's a professor at the University of Michigan, Ann Arbor, and we would go from Ann Arbor to Detroit to volunteer at the Capuchin Soup Kitchen and working with ID and birth records. And we would talk to folks about ID, birth records, also the things that they cared about and what they wanted to sort of build in their communities. And what were the experiences they were experiencing as homeless folks or people who were transient. And one of the things that we got to do was help shape policy on anti-homelessness measures, bed bug measures, et cetera. But the thing that I think was the core of that work was getting people ID and birth records. Now, I would argue that is not organized, but stick with the story and with me and come back. The second thing that shaped my life and got me involved in this work is in '08 and in '07 I was knocking doors and registering voters for Obama. I was swept up in the sea of hope and change. As a young Black person who was inspired. As David mentioned, that is a mobilization activity. We often, as a society, in a lot of the Obama branding, we've often told people that like just the idea of showing up and talking to your neighbor is enough that you are now an organizer. But it mistakes the idea of long-term power building and community building for a short-term one-off activity. And it actually also mistakes the idea that we actually get better at this work the more that we do it. The more and more that we spend time being in community, being in relationship with people, we become better organizers. The more and more that we're thinking about ourselves as a tool for this work, the better we are. But the thing that actually shaped me, and this is the part I want to really, hone in on organizing is towards the end of my college career, I got arrested. And I thought the smartest thing that I can do was hide it from my family and my friends and my professors and folks and try to hide out in the Washtenaw County Jail. And the people that I met while I was in the Washtenaw County Jail looked like me, young Black folks, but many times they were often younger than me and they were, going to prison. And as a person working class, parents who have been impacted by the criminal legal system, friends who've been impacted by the criminal legal system, I looked at them, sort of with my head, my mind blown that, how can you live in Ann Arbor? How can you live in Ypsilanti, et cetera, and be trapped in a cycle of poverty? This is one of the wealthiest counties in the country, with some of the best public schools, et cetera. And they also looked at me as if I had three heads, being a Black person who went to Michigan, who wasn't on the football or basketball team, but was also, there. And so, that was one of the sort of shape moments that I was thinking about shaping, like who gets opportunity and who doesn't. And my mentor that I talked about at the beginning of this conversation, Greg, untangled my legal situation, privilege and opportunity, things that that folks who don't look like me don't, often get to experience. We're able to untangle my legal situation, just by asking, by folks asking him, my parents asking him. And when we met after all of that, he challenged me to think about this spectrum of organizing that Don was sort of alluding to. It's like this idea, this metaphor that I often use a lot of times in organizing, this metaphor or parable of the babies in the river. That, if you want to go down this journey with me, like close your eyes and imagine that we're in a village. Green grass, ice-capped mountains, blue skies, sort of like the sound of music, the village and the sound of music. And as we're walking closer and closer in the village, we see a river. And as we're walking closer and closer and we look inside the river, we see a baby. But not one baby. We see multiple babies streaming down that river from the ice-capped mountains all the way, across the river. And, the responses from a lot of the villagers may be, well, maybe we should put a fence around the river to make sure no babies get into it. Or, hey, maybe we should have towels waiting on the babies so when they get out of the river, they can dry themselves off. Maybe we should have a little handrail so the babies can pull themselves up out of the river. But nobody actually asked in the village, like, why the hell are the babies in the river in the first place? And organizing is about, engaging with those babies to keep this metaphor going, but also the folks that live around that river and making sure that the people who are at the top of that mountain that are putting the babies in the river are held accountable and that they never do it again. So that's how I think about organizing. It's not just about a one-time, one-off sort of like opportunity. It's about leadership development. That is the core and crux of the work, is democratizing who gets to be a leader, who gets to have a say in like what policy is, what are the opportunities, what are the actions, but then also making sure that we're winning and fighting for structural and material gains. Like that is the name of the game. Like we actually want to be able to have material gains, but it's about making sure that everyone and people who are directly impacted, regardless of how we define that, have a say in what those material gains and those outcomes look like.
I like that metaphor a lot. And it sort of made me think about like all the different um, all the different ways that when the revolution is coming, people can use their skills to do different things. So in the baby metaphor, like there's some people who are trying to, you know, triage the trauma, and there's some people who are trying to teach the villagers about the root cause of the problem. And so thinking about this in a multifaceted, um, I don't know, multi-skill way, I think is really, really important. I'm going to move us now to our third question, which is the last prepared question. Then we'll move into discussion after that. And this one is really about movement building and the conditions for power. And so, thinking about the news, um, just yesterday, labor unions, community organizations, faith organizations across the Twin Cities coordinated a citywide general strike to force ICE out of their communities. I'd be shocked if you didn't see some sort of headline about this. Um, that kind of mass disruption clearly didn't just come out of nowhere. It wasn't the case that 100,000 Minnesotans said, like, I think today is the day that I'm going to go out into the street when we have a high of -10. Um, this was only really possible because of years of relationship building, shared infrastructure, and organizations that became capable of acting together. Um, as just a shout out, my entire family's in Minneapolis. They were all out in the streets, and it's just like such a cool, terrible thing to see. Um, with this all in mind, where do you all see the conditions for that kind of movement building taking shape right now? Where are the sort of prime opportunities? And where do you think those conditions are still missing in the political landscape, even in places where participation appears high? So I will pitch it off and see who unmutes first. Let's go to Brianna first.
I'm always willing to take the first go of it because you guys will fill in the rest, right? So I think, I mean, this is something that we didn't talk a ton about in the last question, but where examples of where the organizing has seen that durable power. And I think that's exactly right, Dom, like what you talked about there, like mass strikes, right? So that's something different than those one-off protests that we see in the streets, but it's building that power of labor. So labor labor unions, our workplaces, that's a place where we have the opportunity to impact capital. And so we see that We've seen that in Minneapolis. We've seen that in the past. David brought up a lot of good examples from the beginning over history where labor has been able to take hold of that power. And I think, in the same way, I think Laura mentioned this earlier, is in our labor unions, we have that opportunity to exercise and practice democracy. And so when we're practicing democracy in our labor unions, that's that's one element of it. The other thing we have in our labor unions um, is the ability to have those ongoing organizing conversations and build those relationships that are deep and meaningful and continue to build off of one another. So, I mean, I think I've given so many plugs for Metro Detroit DSA. I will throw that link in the chat because I think that is that's one organization that is doing this work in coalition with labor and building unions and identifying workplaces. I think another organization that I volunteer with, the Emergency Worker Organizing Committee, EWOC, which identifies volunteers around the country to support labor organizing. So people that are like, I don't know where to start. I want a union, but I'm not ready. A big union's not going to take me on right now. There are people who are volunteering, and we need to build up the labor movement, right? We need more unions. But we also need to be thinking about strategic places where those labor unions can really hurt capital and hurt those corporate folks that are in control right now. So I think those are just a couple of ways, like where we need to build up. And in terms of like conditions are still missing, I think we got a lot of work to do here in Michigan, right? I'm so inspired by what happened in Minnesota. But I've been talking with folks, we have work to do in our own union. We have work to do across Michigan in labor and how we build that and how we do that. I'm excited to be in conversation with you guys about.
Yeah, and I think there are different levels of zooming in and out of sites of opportunity for this, like you said, in your own union, but also at the state level. Um, all right, who would like to go next about um, conditions for movement building?
I can jump in. I just want to say regarding the previous question, comparing mobilizing and organizing, this isn't a link to the book, but to a review of the book called How Organizations Develop Activists by Hari Han. And it's the whole book is about the difference between mobilizing and organizing. And she goes into detail. She's a political scientist. So I recommend that. Just forgot what else I was going to say. I think, everybody's kind of already saying, what I think it is important to understand, which is that thinking of community organizing and labor organizing as building blocks that are valuable in their own work, but then at times can link together effectively for what we see as mass movements. So like's been said, in Minneapolis, there's many organizations on the ground, who have been around for a while. And when there's a sense of urgency in the public, I think that they are in a position to respond to that. I think, it's exciting to see that people out in the streets and and also businesses that are willing to close the boycotts. And I think that shows an underlying tension that's being exposed, and it also can show the extent of the interconnectedness that they built there. I think there's a tendency, after a mass mobilization to say, what came as a result of that, and that's always a useful question to ask. But I think that, from an organizing perspective, my sense is that it's the production of that in itself and the experience provided is valuable in itself, and it also is pressure for power for particular results. So kind of thinking about it in that way, and just going back to what Brandon was saying, when I think about the difference between organizing and mobilizing, I think of organizing as creating developmental leadership, developing leadership. And so I think that's the most probably important thing about what I understand to be democratic, small d, democratic organizing compared to the way it's described in public, which is usually described as kind of agitating people or causing trouble, that it's actually ongoing work with people to achieve their goals in relation to understanding of power relations, which is and building something together. So the electoral organizing has the benefit of this direct time frame set by elections by law. So the campaigns go to move towards a clear time. If you understand a campaign as a battle, from the French countryside campagne or whatever years ago, the idea of a campaign is set by a time. And so a labor campaign, as you all know, also has a time frame that's decided on by the contract negotiation. So a community organizing issue campaign has both the drawbacks of not having a set campaign, but the time frame, but the benefit of the members creating that time frame based on what they think is important, whether it be an election, whether it be we need this by now for our community, So I tend to think about it in comparing them in that ways. And then, yeah, I feel like I've lost the question. Is that do you have different organizations trying to achieve something, and you kind of need a window, an opportunity window in which these different organizations create a mobilization based on their goals. That's how I see it. But there's a lot of serendipity to it, and also, in response to things happening. So you have this brutal force acting and people are responding. But they were strategically thinking and organizing before that. So
Yeah, yeah, I like what you're saying about to me what I'm hearing is like maybe urgency is the wrong word, but like time frames impose. I mean, I'm a big procrastinator, always have been with homework when I was a kid, but like the deadline is what got me to do the stuff, right? So I think in some ways, like urgency there is a condition that can really yield really excellent results, but at the same time can be sort of a liability. So sort of serves both purposes.
and I just want to underscore and mention that when you have so many people out in the streets, when you have so many people directly affected like they've never been before in Minnesota, people being dragged out of their cars, sprayed in the face, that's there's going to be outrage. There's just going to be the 6 degrees of separation are going to be activated. People are going to respond. But that level of brutality, it's happening all the time. So unfortunately, that's a reality. So that we know all about George Floyd, and we know about how he represented so many others, and the deportation system has been grinding away for many years. So I don't want to undermine the moment that's happening now, but the fact that things are especially terrible right now, it's kind of, for me, it's a culmination of what sort of we've all allowed to have happen at a lower level of attention, and politically, this is where we've arrived. So.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much, Laura. Brandon, David, either of you want to add to this? Oh, I see you both on mute. Let's start with Brandon.
Yeah, I'll be super short. So the one thing I want to make sure that I'm emphasizing is just this idea that the general strike that we saw didn't just happen overnight, that it was years and years and years and years of work, but it was also years and years and years of base building, that deep spade work that, Ella Baker talks about, that happened within each organization and formation. And the thing that I want to leave folks with is that some of the roots for that happened in 2020 during the George Floyd mobilization. Some of that happened what we saw when people built all these different networks and built all of these different vehicles to to respond to community, both because of the pandemic, but also because of the massive uprising. But one of the things that I think that is often forgotten, at least by outsiders in this case study, is that directly after the uprisings, in 2020 with post George Floyd, was that many of the community partners were testing out their opportunity to like, can we make a difference through a local ballot initiative that will reorganize, public safety, and groups, led on an issue, led on the exact experiences that Laura just talked about that were happening to people in a variety of communities. And unfortunately, they lost. But the idea that we have to think about when we're thinking about elections and the opportunity to organize through elections is that this idea of falling forward is that we're not always going to hit to score a touchdown. We're not always going to like win, but we actually have to be thinking about like how are we strengthening our muscles as a movement? How are we deepening our relationships? And then what are the opportunities to take advantage of the conditions coming out of that loss? And so there are a lot of things that took place, in the last 4, 5, 6 years since the George Floyd uprising, since that public safety ballot campaign, since, all the things that we saw in 2020. And the other thing, the last lesson I'll leave is that what requires is a little bit of what David said earlier in his lecture, the PowerPoint, is that we actually need a united Democratic front when we're thinking about these type of movements. When you think about South Africa and the anti-apartheid movement of the 1980s and beyond, the United Democratic Front, was a network of what about 500 or so organizations across spectrum. So it had a strong youth movement. It had a strong, labor and union component. It had a strong component for a variety of organizations, all with a singular focus around how do you strengthen democracy and how do you repeal and dismantle apartheid. And so for us, as we're tackling, the two dual forces of centrism and fascism, we actually have to be thinking about like what's our United Democratic Front and like what can we learn from these moments of formation that we're seeing in Minneapolis and across the country this year.
Yeah, thank you. I agree with Laura. I love the idea of falling forward. And like, even when you fail a ballot initiative, the process of organizing leaves you stronger, right? And so thinking about that as a process of building rather than a process of trying and failing. And David.
Just two quick thoughts of opportunities now. One is, a lot of our locals are involved in very good charity community service work, and I, I don't want to denigrate that at all. But we can also start thinking about the difference between charity and solidarity. And are we building relationships with groups that are organizing people, right? And the whole effort against ICE, those two levels where it's like, okay, we want to directly monitor ICE and members that are at that can do that, or maybe we just want to deal with the aftermath with people might be more comfortable with. The other thing I just want to throw out there is if you're looking to strengthen ties with the community, do not underestimate the importance of physical space. Having done a lot of organizing, like where do we like literally meet in all of our events? And you've got union halls, and I was impressed years ago. Local 600, they spoke about they had, they built all these relationships with community organizations, and using their physical infrastructure was part of that. Just allowing people to come to their literally physically their local and do their stuff.
Yeah, thank you all so much. I feel like such a robust discussion about conditions, which are strategic and tactical and like a real logistical aspect of the organizing process that, sometimes gets left out of that conversation. So we're at 11:41. I am going to now turn it to you all as attendees. I'm gonna unpin everybody. And I'd like to encourage folks to now turn on your cameras as you're able to. And we want to open up to a larger discussion and include as many people in the room as possible. And I think right now, instead of solely focusing on our reflections coming out of the panel, or like reflections in sort of a, I don't know, reflective, a non-action based way, I'd like for us to think about how today's conversation can orient us towards making our own actions. So I have some questions for you all that I'm going to put on a slide. And then right immediately after that, we will have an opportunity for you all to ask questions directly of our panelists. Let's see if I can manage to get my screen share to work. All right. Believe you can see this. So questions that I have for you all, what does this conversation mean for how we organize going forward? And maybe put a slightly different way, is there something about this conversation, something that one of the panelists said that really made something click for you about how we think about movement building more broadly? And so I will mute myself. And I would love if anybody feels free to unmute themselves. You can put an answer in the chat or the like. Um, but what does this mean for you? And like, how does maybe this conversation reorient your own thinking about the organizing that's required of us moving forward?
I'll jump in there. This has been really positive and uplifting for me. It's not necessarily new information, but it's good to hear other people saying things, I think. For 20 years, I was a community organizer in Chicago, and it was a constant battle between the old school, who defined organizing as how many people can you get on a bus, and the left-leaning organizers who were like, no, it's about building movement. Um, and so I just want to thank all of you. This is really making me feel more positive about moving forward.
That's awesome. I love to hear that, Julia. Any other thoughts coming out of this question? Yeah, go ahead, Cheryl.
I did message Brendan, because he gave me a lot to think about. But one of my things I've been struggling with over the last several years is we're getting so many appeals from so many left and other groups, and send money, sign this petition, then send money. How do we unite some of these groups? I know a lot of it has to do with personal power. You all know some groups that they don't want to give up anything and they don't want to work with others because it's going to, weaken them. But how on earth do we get these left groups together and put aside their personal little fiefdom issues? I don't have the answer. I'm asking a question.
Yeah, I think it's a really good question, and I mean, I would love if anyone here, panelist or not, would want to jump in. But I mean, I think the question that you're asking here is, as we're thinking about the process of organizing, which is having conversations with people who don't fully agree with you, I think the same can be said on an organizational scale. I mean, that's the question, right? And how is that different or the same as doing person-to-person organizing is a question I don't have the answer to. I'm mostly just restating it. But I think that's a really excellent question. Does anyone have thoughts about that?
I also do not have the answer, but I think the thing that I think about most when you put this question forward, Cheryl, is that some of this is also a product of the nonprofitization of our movement and the sort of massive expansion of like money in politics, right? And so, I work for a nonprofit, so I'm not completely, absolved from this. I'm complicit, and I think that as we think about like this explosion of like money and resources, we have the most money in politics, the most money in our movement, but like the least amount of power. And so there is a little bit of work that we do have to be thinking about around consolidating. How are we and by consolidate, I'm talking about from like the leftist perspective of like how are we moving ourselves into a shared lanes and like working on the play things that we're good at versus like taking on more. And so that is a thing that I think requires a lot of work and a lot of us rowing in the same direction. But it will also require us deepening our relationships with people from these different movements to where, people can see that, okay, I don't actually need to organize young people. There's a group out there that I trust that can do it, and I want to support them. Or, oh, I don't need to be working about or worried about organizing tenants or whomever. There's a group out there that I trust that can do it, and I want to support them versus groups owning these fiefdoms. So I think that there's a little bit of that, a lot of work that we actually have to do also, and then um, yeah, I don't think there's a simple, solid answer to like how do we, because we are getting these solicitations and calls for help, and it's a lot of things that are happening too. So.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, it's a tough question to answer, and I think like applying these principles is, I don't know if trickle up is a worthwhile thing to say, but moving from the organizers up to, leaderships and organizations, I think is sort of the way that this happens. Um, in the chat from Joshua N, um, it seems like something that clicked is thinking about actions within unions and how actions and priorities represent the the needs and priorities of members versus something in a broader view. You mentioned at the state and federal level, and so maybe some more awareness about context. I think is an important aspect to this. I'm going to move on to the next question in the interest of time. So, if we take democratic capacity seriously, what should institutions do differently? And specifically, this question, I've included CLCS, the Center for Labor and Community Studies, as one of these institutions, but we could be talking about any sort of institution that is within this sort of side of the political spectrum. So, what needs to happen from these organizations that have, maybe relatively more power than an individual?
I'll jump in again if nobody's saying anything. Um, I I'm gonna put some blame on Michigan AFL-CIO without even knowing much about them, but I'll jump out there and say it because not being in Detroit during the newspaper movement strike and then coming here and everybody I meet my age, all they can talk 30 years later about is the newspaper strike. But I don't see anybody using those people who are now working in other industries because they all lost their newspaper jobs or they never worked in the newspaper to begin with. But it seems like there wasn't an institution that kept that power together. And in my head, as an outsider, a quasi outsider, I would say state AFL-CIO seems to make sense. I don't know how to make them. Well, I do know how to make them. We need to go back to our unions and have everybody, the union I work for sent no delegates to the state convention, and we need to start doing that more.
Yeah, yeah. The importance of sort of um, federations, confederations, groups of organizations talking to each other really needs to get beefed up, is what I'm hearing. And then Liz in the chat says leadership development. Do you want to say a little bit about that, Liz?
Yeah, I heard from I think all of the panelists talking about the importance of leadership development in this context. And I know at CLCS we've done incredible work with regular conferences and other programming to help develop leaders within their unions and other spaces. And also we can continue to expand and build on that work, I think. And to some of the comments in the chat, I think from Joshua N, focusing on some of the younger folks, young workers who are really who might be interested and have a really strong uh, take on the current political climate, but don't have institutions who are actively working to ensure that they have power and can make decisions within the institutions. Um, and that can be disheartening in terms of thinking about outside of the institution how daunting it is to try to influence and create change. So I think leadership development, for each and every one of us, thinking about replacing ourselves in certain contexts, but also as an institution, um, that I think is something that a role that institutions, organizations can play, especially continuity and institutional memory and in connecting, to Julia's point, past fights, past lessons to the current context that we're in.
Mm-hmm. Nice. Thank you very much, Liz. Um, and then I have this last question here, and I think in the interest of time, I will also do sort of a general Q&A at this point. But what commitments, experiments, next steps feel necessary in this moment, either for you specifically or for a larger constituency within the movement? And I think at this time too, I would like to invite Shaterika, and please tell me if I'm saying your name incorrectly, to speak about their experience in Detroit as well. They put something in the chat earlier. So anybody feel free to answer, and then I also invite Shaterika to talk about their experience specifically.
Hello, I'm at work. The kids will be started. So I literally just ran to a space so I could talk. Okay, so I want to talk about a couple different things. Just a brief information on me. I was out in the field before doing community action against asthma with the University of Michigan. That experience traveled over into my political ordeals as I was going door to door for the 2004 election. And there was just so many different things that I noticed. We were on a temporary unemployment. Stellantis had been doing that for like a year and a half. So I used that time to go out in the field because, usually I'm at work. So usually I can't even be in the field. There were so many issues. First of all, a lot of these people are just out there for the money. They're trying to get some money. So they don't have no passion when they're out there talking to the people. And as a person, you come into my house, you have to you got about 2 seconds to get my interest. 2 to 5 seconds. You know what I'm saying? You don't have a lot of time. If you come to me sounding dry, don't sound like you really want to be here. I'm not going to talk to you. They were so surprised because my numbers, I could easily get 30 people every single day to sign up, to want to talk, to get emails, and you know what I mean? But I had that experience that I get. So first of all, these people need some real training. They just want to go and take on a political job. They haven't had any experiences. They don't understand the ordeals that's really going on. So the people are not interested. So, yeah, you know what I mean? Half the time, I was getting people that nobody else could get to talk. Second of all, I'm a UAW worker. So many people in the Metro Detroit area, I'm wearing my jacket while I'm out. They want to talk to you. Because you know what? You work in the industry that I either retired from, my parents was in, my cousins, my daughter. That relatability matters. Any relatability, and like I got my house built from the ground up through in Habitat as a single mother. If people were like, you know what, I want to talk, but I'm really having housing issues, I would give them information on other stuff. It's so hard to focus on the election. You don't have food in your house. You don't know where you're going. You know what I mean? So I was teaching people. They were like, I'm not making a lot of money. I'm like, I'm a Dollar Tree shopper. The same thing. Or when you go to Kroger, look for the deals. I was giving other information, not just voting information. So they were so related to me on every level. Oh, you're a single mom. You understand. Oh, you had just bought your house. You understand. Yeah. Oh, you're a UAW. You understand. You work on the line. there was so many different aspects that I could relate. I'm in school. I just graduated from Wayne State with my MBA. Stuff like all these things. I'm a CAS graduate. Pick an avenue.
Right,
And
right.
because they saw I wasn't out there for the money, because the
Yeah,
money was nothing.
yeah.
You know what I mean? There was just the ideology of elections and they don't get it. And I hate to be honest, but lack of knowledge is everything. So
Uh-huh.
sometimes I'm out there educating people. If you don't know this stuff like the back of your hand, past elections, what we did good on, what we didn't do good on, you have to be able to have that patience. So there's some times where I might be at a house for 2 minutes. Then there's other times I might have to be at a house for 25 minutes
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
because I have to educate, because I have to talk. And then I say, hey, talk to this about your people because I can't reach everybody.
Yeah,
You know
yeah,
what
yeah,
I
yeah.
mean? Like there was so many different things that I mean, it was just so much. But
Yeah,
even the people that didn't want to talk, that weren't for Democrats, and they were even comfortable telling me that, you know what, Trump is a businessman, and that is why I'm going with Trump. Okay, thank you very much. I will notate that and we
sure,
won't bother
sure.
you again. But even I was biased. I never was, oh, you're going to vote for, you know what I mean? I think very safe, whatever you choose, it's your choice. I'm just
Yeah,
telling you what the facts are. This is what it is. They were, I mean, even I'm talking about, in South, in areas that were very Trumpified, where even people there were talking to, they felt comfortable. So there
sure,
was just
sure.
so many different, there was just so much. A
Yeah,
lot of people had moved. They
I
didn't update that.
and I'm gonna just step in really
A lot
briefly,
of
just in
those.
the interest of
Okay.
time. I really, really appreciate everything you're saying here, Shaterika. I think, this is sort of at the core of what we've been talking about, right? That organizing is inherently relational, right? It's not something where we can, pass an info sheet to the person who we canvass and say, okay, job's done, like I'm giving my paycheck. It is something where we have to meet people as people, and understand their needs, the emotions that they're feeling, their reactions to the political landscape, and um, work with that, right? So what Shaterika is talking about here is like, she had her own experience around affordability, about being a single mother, about, this, that, and the other thing. And that is actually a huge asset, when it comes into organizing conversations, because, you know, uh, one human wants to hear another human talking about being a human, not about, some abstraction. So I think that's a really wonderful note for us to end on. I do want to also leave it open in case there are other questions. So I will stay on, and I think I can twist the arms of the panelists to stay on for maybe 3 more minutes. Um, but we're at noon. I really want to thank you all for being here, and sharing this space with us today. I think we had a really robust conversation. And as I mentioned at the top of the meeting, the symposium has been recorded, and so that will be put on our website. We'll also be sending out some resources, and sort of things that came out of this conversation. But yeah, I thank you all for being here. Have a wonderful rest of your day. Oh, and Ghana has her hand up, so I will let her have the last word.
Um, Also, we have another symposium coming up on March 14th. Just to throw that plug out there, it is on workers' compensation. We have Michael Dowd, who is a workers' comp lawyer. And if anybody is interested, the flyers will be going out soon. Don is working on them. This was a great symposium, and I thank everybody that came on as well. And the speakers were amazing. So you guys keep up the good work and, stay in the fight.
Wonderful. What a good way to end this meeting. Thank you all so much. Please stay warm out there, and take care, everyone. Solidarity forever.